Good morning. I see we have another shallow ship, but we'll push on with this one. A couple of things before we get underway. One, I looked at the quizzes, and on one of them I had misspelled a word which could throw people off on the question, so I'm going to send out a notice to those people that I'm just going to give them the point if you had that one wrong, because that was me on that one. Aside from that, today should be a short day because we actually got ahead of schedule last class, which is a pretty good thing. So when we're done, we're done. That said, though, when we come back on Tuesday, it's a review. And so that review is going to cover everything from the end of the Renaissance all the way to the 20th century. We're ending neoclassicism, and we're going to get to realism, where we are right now. And so that review is going to be very large. There's a lot of major figures to cover. So with that, arms up with the band. All right. Mask up. And Gesamtkunstwerk. Gesamtkunstwerk. Kunstwerk. What am I talking about? Okay, what's the translation? Total work of art, the master work, the master artist. Thanks, man. Get it in now, guys. I promise you will see that one again. Gesamtkunstwerk. Who is associated with that term? Wagner. Richard Wagner. Wagner's big thing was everything you saw on that stage, he was responsible for. The music you heard, the costumes he looked over, the casting of the performers. He was that one driving force that puts it together, the total work going through this one individual. Nothing was left to, just try and see what you can do there. Who turned the lights down over the audience? David Garrett. David Garrett was the owner of Drury Lane, one of the two big theaters in London. He basically stepped in and decided, we're going to change the way that the actors and the audience behave. For the actors, he set up a whole bunch of rules with a fine system. For the audience, he got them off the stage. They could no longer just pay to sit that close. And he turned down the lights over the audience, which was a shocker for them. Something that we continue to do today. Of course, it doesn't carry the same shock value it did at that time. What was the period in which theater returned to England? The Restoration. What was it a restoration of? The monarchy. The monarchy was going to be reestablished. Charles II, who had been living over in France, is brought back after the English Civil War had completed itself, and it was the end of the Commonwealth. It was the end of the Commonwealth, where the monarchy does not exist in England. And under the Commonwealth, theater was banned, and during the Restoration, Charles comes back, and he brings back theater. He brings back music. He brings back all the things that had been banned under Puritan rule. It is during the Restoration that for the first time on stage, England has women. It is during the Restoration that women began to perform on stage in Britain. And it was a big change. Remember, Shakespeare had only died in 1616 and never saw a woman on stage in one of his performances. And here we are a generation later, and everything changes, unfortunately due to a civil war. Who was the first professional female playwright? I heard it. Aphra Behn. Aphra Behn was the first professional female playwright. Remember, she's not the first female playwright. She is not the first female playwright. We know there were female playwrights before. She is the first woman who is earning her living by writing plays. And so there's a big difference in that one. And so, yeah, Aphra Behn. What was her masterwork? The Rover, or the Bandit Cavaliers, or the Forgotten Cavaliers, but The Rover for short. And so that was her big hit. What major movement is going to replace neoclassicism? Romanticism. Yes. Romanticism is the emotional movement that's replacing the intellectual movement. It is no longer we have to do it like this, we have to do it like this, we have to do it like this. It becomes much more of how do we feel about it? You know, what is this going to lead us to? Under Romanticism, what was the main style of theater to explode? Melodrama. And so melodrama becomes that big awakening in theater. In fact, I think your crash course actually did a really good job talking about that one. In fact, it highlighted what show? I talked about it also. Under the Gaslight, where the train almost hits the guy on the tracks. Becomes this iconic image people start repeating everywhere. What was the most performed play in American history? Uncle Tom's Cabin. Everywhere you went, that play was being put on. The version that everybody knew was a melodrama. And so the most performed play in this country's history is a melodrama, Uncle Tom's Cabin. You know, it was that big hit that everybody knew. You know, we had the Noble Savage story that becomes big during melodrama. You know, people start talking about how we got to get closer to the earth. You know, science is going to lead us astray. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein illustrates that very well. And then comes Charles Darwin's work, The Origin of Species. And then we begin another shift away from Romanticism, and we find ourselves with realism. So those are the big movements that I want you to know. We have neoclassicism, we have Romanticism, and then we have realism. Neoclassicism is a product of the Renaissance. You know, when we get to Romanticism, we're in the Enlightenment. And then when we get to realism, we're in the Industrial Age. And so those movements, no movement starts and finishes at a certain time. They all overlap because somebody doesn't get on the phone and just say, realism's over, let's move. And so there's a lot of overlap, but basically at a certain point, one begins to dominate the other and the other falls by the wayside. When we got to realism, I talked about the fact that, we may be romantics at heart, but for the most part, when we sit down and watch something, realism's the dominant form today. The stories might be romantic, but the presentation and everything that goes along with it, that's realism. There were two individuals that we're going to talk about. One of them we got to, the other one we're going to cover today. The one we got to is the father of modern drama. Ibsen. The first name gave it away, don't worry. Henrik Ibsen. Henrik Ibsen. Ibsen was that Norwegian playwright who began writing shows, if you remember these, which were problem plays. Problem plays were plays that address social issues. Up until this time, all the playwrights we've talked about, Lope de Vega, he was writing to make a living. Moliere, he was writing to make a living. Shakespeare, he was writing to make a living. Ibsen, he is making a living with his work. However, his big thing is his work is attempting to cause social change. He is trying to make topics that people are not addressing, that they're going to start addressing, and actually hopefully cause change. And so problem playwrights were not playwrights who were sitting down saying, I'm going to make a fortune on this play, as much as, hopefully this play will do something. They had novels and everything else that fall under. Sinclair Lewis's The Jungle changed the way that this country processes food. Problem works are vital in our culture. And so what was the most important of Ibsen's works? A Doll's House. And what happens at the end of A Doll's House? She leaves her family. They said it was the door slam heard round the world. But Nora gets up there and basically says, this is not what I am or who I am or what I want to be. This is not, the life that I chose. This is the life I've gotten. I'm going to go do something else. And so she just leaves, unable to buy property, unable to, get a passport without her husband. She just basically just walks out at a time when women were chattel. And so a lot of people point to this as one of the earliest examples of a problem play addressing women's rights. And so today we're going to pick up with another problem playwright, and it's this guy, George Bernard Shaw. George Bernard Shaw, GBS. Now, Shaw, like Ibsen, was a problem playwright. Unlike Ibsen, who was writing in Norwegian, of course, Shaw was writing in English. He was an Irishman. And Shaw, unlike every other problem playwright that I can name, Shaw wrote comedies. That was really his masterwork in all this. He wrote comedies, and basically he wrote satire about the world. He basically looked at what was going on and wrote it in such a way that people could laugh about it, but then they also walked out, and like Ibsen's plays, they started talking about things that weren't very popular. Now, one of the reasons behind this is Shaw does not begin his career as a playwright until he is 40. Shaw starts very late. And the reason is, his first half of his life, he's a journalist. And as a journalist, he's covering a lot of the issues that later on he is going to begin writing about in his plays. And so basically you could say the first 40 years were research. And then after he had a ton of research behind him, then it was time to actually start producing something. Miss Warren's profession. Hopefully you can tell me, what is that profession? Yes, what is it? Prostitution. Miss Warren's profession. Miss Warren is a madam. She basically runs a bunch of other prostitutes. She had been a prostitute at one time. And so this was one of his earliest hits as a problem play, and yes, it was banned. Like Ibsen, his work did not see a lot of light of day. And so in the play, what is this problem that's being addressed? No, it's not coming in there and condemning prostitution. What they're coming in there and condemning is Miss Warren is confronted, and people are like, you're intelligent, you're smart, you do all these things. Why is it that you are doing this? And she says, because I have been given no other choices. I cannot, open a store. I cannot, buy a shop somewhere. I'm not allowed to work in a bank. I can't work in high finance. I can't run for office. I don't get to vote. I don't get this. She goes over a whole litany of things that she is denied. And then in the end, she says, what other profession am I left where I can make as much money as a man? And basically she tells him, when you give me better options, I'll take the better options. But as long as this is what I have to do to be independently wealthy, this is what I'm going to do. And so, just as a doll's house is a woman standing up and saying, this isn't what I signed up for, Miss Warren turns around and basically says, these are the options that I have been given. And now you condemn me for taking the best option if I want to be independent and wealthy. Miss Warren's profession. This is possibly his most famous play. Now, it's not his master work. It's not the work that people are always grabbing and saying, oh, you got to see this one. This play is going to change you. It's the most famous play because it's been adapted a few times, and its adaptations have become big hits. But the play is Pygmalion. And Pygmalion's problem in it is the class system in Britain. In Britain, if you were born into a family that, are, working fishing, when you grow up on the boat, and when you became, an adult, you were working on the boat, and when you died, guess what? You were probably at sea on the boat, because there was no opportunity to move or change what you were going to do. That was the system in which Shaw found himself, especially being an Irishman coming over. And so in Pygmalion, a flower girl, who has a Cockney accent, which is anything but a clean way. If you've ever heard a Cockney accent, I can promise you'll sit there going, that's not English, even though it is. A professor of linguistics makes a bet that within a certain amount of time, he can pass her off as a duchess. And basically his argument is this. The class system is built on education. And if you give him enough time, he can teach her. And he can teach her how to speak and how to act, where she can walk into a social situation and be passed off as nobility. And everybody laughed because, well, no, it's impossible. Look at her. She's selling flowers on the side of the road. Nobody can barely, understand what she's saying. And of course, he takes her in, works with her, and by the end of the play, everyone's convinced when they take her to a party that, she must be, this debutante who's just been brought in. She's the belle of the ball. And so it defies the class system. It basically points out that, if we started educating everybody, what happens to the class system? Well, then you don't have people working in the fisheries. And so this is the reason the play is probably mostly known. It was adapted into the musical My Fair Lady. It's the adaptation of this adaptation of this play which made it famous. The play was good. The musical became a super hit, which then everybody starts talking about. Oh yeah, it's based on Pygmalion. It's based on Pygmalion. It's hard to find a production of Pygmalion, but you can always find a production of My Fair Lady going on somewhere. And the big difference between the two is in My Fair Lady, the voice lessons are songs. And so instead of having her, constantly repeating just nursery rhymes and stuff, they actually sing through most of it. This is argued easily to be his great work, Major Barbara. Major Barbara is a major in the Salvation Army. What is the Salvation Army? We have them in the United States, folks. I hope the silence is a lot of contemplation. What is the Salvation Army? I guess I'll give you more than a hint. In this country, for the most part, we know the Salvation Army because of their thrift stores. And we also know them because of their ringing of bells at the holiday seasons in front of stores. And this basically is what we know of them here. But, the money that they're raising through their thrift stores and the money that they're raising through the collecting of change actually goes toward a lot of different charities that they host. Homeless shelters, orphanages. The Salvation Army was a Christian organization that was founded in Britain, which became vital during the time of the Depression. It ran bread lines and soup lines, and it continues to thrive today. Well, Major Barbara is a major in it, and so she is wholeheartedly in there trying to save people's souls. The idea of salvation. Shaw wasn't a very big fan of them. And you can see it in the play because all these people are there to pray with the Salvation Army. Why? Because they're starving. And they know after the prayers and everything that they'll be attending, they'll be fed. Well, Barbara's going to have quite a decision to make soon in this play. And the reason is her father is the largest munitions manufacturer in Britain. So what do I mean? Munitions? Weapons. He makes armaments. He makes explosives. The idea of all this behind the side of Major Barbara. You have Barbara, who is constantly trying to save souls, and when she argues with her father, he's like, why are you fighting with me? I'm giving you more souls to save. Her father is just this wonderful character named Undershaft, who, has these great diatribes that he breaks into saying, if you have three guys in the street and they're just rabble, you give them guns and they're a revolution. Guns are the only thing that make people equal in this world. All revolution occurs with a bullet. And then he says, don't blame me for what's happening in this world. I didn't choose sides. I sell to both sides. I sell to our military and I sell to the opposing military. I sell to the North and the South. I sell to the East and the West. I have no stake in it. Let them sort out their problems. Our job is simple. We're making a profit. And so, you can imagine how family dinners are a little bit tense at times. Barbara is in love with a linguist, and basically her father says, well, let's see, how much he loves you. And basically he goes to the linguist and says, so she wants you to save souls and everything else. Well, I want to leave you this factory, and I want you to take over when I pass away. And now he has a decision to make, she's probably not going to like it, but we'd be wealthy. We'd be running this factory and everything else. And in the end of the play, Barbara goes to him and says, I think we should take the factory. And everybody thinks that she's going to say something like, and then we can shut it down and all this. And she says, with all the money we'll make with it, we can actually put more money into saving people. And so you're left with this eerie feeling of, isn't that like, a little bit of a contradiction? Now, I talked about the fact that Shaw and Ibsen saw their plays get canned a lot before they even opened. Every time that their plays were to be opened, they ran into issues. Remember, even in the United States, Ibsen's work was considered a sewer at times, as the review in Chicago said of Ghost. And so it became this obstacle. Well, if their plays are being banned all the time, well, how'd they become so important in the theater? And here's the reason. Independent theaters. Their work became famous because of independent theaters. They were the ones who were putting on Shaw. They were the ones who were putting on Ibsen. private performances is the big deal about this. To see a show at an independent theater, you could not buy a ticket. If you bought a ticket, i.e. you went up there and said, hey, I want to see tonight's show, well, then you were a public house. If you were a public house, well, then you had to deal with a censor because anybody could come see it. These private theaters lived off of subscriptions. You had to join the theater. It was like joining a club. And then you would get a mailing that would say, hey, our new show is opening. You know, these are the dates it'll be playing. And you've already paid to see the show through your subscription. Because it was not open to the public, because you had to join and everything to see it, it was not under government censorship. And there were a few of these theaters all over Europe. The first one was in France, Théâtre Libre, which basically just means Theater Liberty. That one was very progressive. When people went to see it, they saw all the things they couldn't see in the big theaters. You know, it was like this, oh my God, why aren't more people putting this on? You know, Germany had their version, Frei Brune, basically translates to free stage. In Britain, they had the Independent Theatre Society, which were the first people to stage Shaw's work. Nobody else was going to take a look at it, but the Independent Theatre Society, their little theater, did put on Shaw. And it was Shaw who also was one of the big people who brought over the work of Ibsen. You know, why? That journalist in him knew about that work. And so the independent theaters that were opening up all over Europe, these little small theaters, are the reason that we talk about Ibsen and Shaw and a handful of other guys whose works could not be shown to the public. And by the public, I mean just selling tickets, come on in, do you want to see it? For the most part, the public tickets were still melodrama. And so one of the things you got to understand, while this is all happening, melodrama is still going. And melodrama is what you're going to find in those big theaters that could seat 3,000, 4,000 people. These theaters could only seat 250. That's a little bit more than half the size of where we are right now. And so they were much smaller theaters. But they had a loyal base of people who were going to see those shows. And so they could put on several nights and still get enough people in there. And the subscriptions to go see them, unfortunately, weren't the cheapest subscriptions because they did have to actually pay for things. But they did function fairly well, and they got things going. In realism, and this is setting up the last of those independent theaters, one of the things that we have to talk about is, we started with, Origin of Species, and that was, biology just changed. Everybody was reading it. And then by the turn of the century, a new science emerged. And this is that guy who led that new science. Anybody know him? Well, they actually offer classes in the subject he mastered, and it is psychology. This is Sigmund Freud. And Freud, basically, everybody starts reading him, because he is basically going to challenge everything that we were being taught and we believed at that time. Up until this moment, you were born bad. The reason people did criminal activities is because there was a criminal gene, and that family was corrupt, which is why all this was occurring. Freud was one of those guys who stepped in and said, well, what was the environment? What happened to them at this point? How were they reared? He wasn't this is nature. He was like, what is nature and nurture? What are those two factors that go together? And so he gave us all these terms, ego, id, stuff that we still use in psychology today when talking about it. Now, I will say that most of his research today is like most of the research by Aristotle. We don't really look at what he found today because, it was very early in the science, and for the most part, we can look at it and go, man, was he nuts? But he laid the groundwork, like Aristotle did with the scientific method. Freud lays the groundwork for psychology to grow into what it has become today, where it's even an academic subject that you study in college. And as much as I can sit here and I could bash Freud all day with a lot of his findings, I mean, he did have some pretty far out stuff that, he believed. There's a handful of things that he wrote that are still relevant today, such as his papers on addiction. At the time, cocaine was used for, oh, you don't feel yourself? Try this. This will make you feel better. Well, yeah, it did. And then he started realizing, man, his patients were really needing a lot of this stuff. And morphine was something that was just given to people, oh God, I can't get rid of this headache. Well, go down to the pharmacist and get some morphine. And so he started finding, oh man, this is another thing that, people are starting to need more and more of. And so his writings on addiction are highly relevant. But when Freud started writing these books, everybody started picking them up, trying to, open up the world. People started, reading about the subconscious, what's happening underneath people's motivations, what do people dream about? How does that, interpret who they are? A lot of things went into this, and as a result, people began questioning in the theater, well, why does the character do this? Why is the character like this? Why does Nora walk out? Why does Major Barber in the end decide, I'm going to take the factory? Why are all these things occurring? And so the theater that really is going to explode with these ideas later is the last of the independents, and that is the Moscow Art Theater. The Moscow Art Theater, which still exists today. All the other independent theaters that were important, Free Stage, Theater Liberty, all of them are part of history. But the Moscow Art Theater continues to perform even today. The Moscow Art Theater eventually was going to also open an actor training school within its grounds. And that's probably the reason it still exists today, is the training of actors, which is really what today is about, was their real progression in this world, what they did to influence all of theater. The Moscow Art Theater, its reputation rests on two individuals, really. One is this playwright, Anton Chekhov. Anton Chekhov. And these 4 plays are the only full-length plays he wrote. He died relatively young. Chekhov was a doctor. He wrote plays on the side. Today, he is considered Russia's great playwright. He is Russia's, when we break things down, Ibsen, easily Norway's great playwright. We can go down the list. Shakespeare, of course, the great playwright of the English language. But Chekhov is that great playwright for the Russian language. The thing is, almost everything that he wrote, he thought of as a comedy. He thought it was pretty funny mostly. He would look at it and just saw humor all over it. And in Russia, there is a lot of humor in it. His plays do not translate well into English. I've never sat through one of his plays and not been catatonic by the end. Just English does not lend itself well. But the productions of his plays weren't very successful until they got to the Moscow Art Theater. And at the Moscow Art Theater, they went under the direction of a man named Konstantin Stanislavski. Konstantin Stanislavski. Now, Stanislavski was the artistic director of the Moscow Art Theater. And when he picked up Chekhov's work, he was convinced these are probably the most important dramas I have seen. This is, what we are as Russians. He thought they were the most nationalistic shows he had seen that represented, the Russian people as a culture. And so he begins putting these plays together, but he's not from a world of melodrama. He's an innovator. He is the person that basically has designed the most dominant acting system that we use even today, but this is its formative years. And so wanted to create a believable truth. When they started their actor training at the Moscow Art Theater, he had some rules that he really pushed forward. And one of them was observation. Sit around, watch how people work. If we're going to do a play and it's going to take place at the docks, go down to the docks. Watch how people work at the docks. Watch how people talk to each other. Observe. Nothing different than Aristotle in that. And he's going to set up this whole system, exercises, improvisation, all these things he's going to start working on. And so when people finally see his production of Chekhov, well, Chekhov actually was a bit horrified by it because it wasn't funny. It wasn't people, oh, look, he's drunk, he just fell down a flight of stairs, which actually is really a Chekhov joke in there. Instead, they saw, people who were devastated, people who were losing everything, people who were, saw their worlds falling apart. They didn't change anything that Chekhov had written. They just performed it where it was real. Well, Chekhov, he was having a heart attack over this. He actually left the theater, got on a train, and left the country, convinced that his career was over with, and unfortunately wasn't there for the standing ovation after ovation after ovation because people were completely blown away by this production. And basically after that, all actor training started going through the Moscow Art Theater in Russia. And when the Moscow Art Theater began to tour all over the world, it started influencing other theater companies, even companies that could not speak Russian at all. They would see these shows and were freaked out because watching their shows was the equivalent of sitting on that dock and watching people. The fact that we turn on the television today and for the most part the acting that we see looks like everyday life comes from this period, and we start to move away from this melodramatic style. That melodramatic style comes from this man. This is Francois Delsarte. And Delsarte was a Frenchman. He was an artist. And during the explosion of science, when people are starting to take a look at Charles Darwin's work, he had this idea that acting was gesture. And yeah, gesture does make a big part of it. But gesture is not everything, and also gesture is usually instinctive. And so everybody's eyes here for a moment. What does it mean when you see this? I don't know, unsure. Now, how do you know that? What? Part of the culture? So where did the culture learn it? Why do people grab their chest when their heart is broken? Why are they always staring down when they're sad? These are the things that Delsarte began to explore. And it's actually quite fascinating for the time period. And so he came up with a book, and as you can see, he goes a little bit overboard at times. But this book was the first attempt at solidifying an actor training method. Before Delsarte, if you wanted to become an actor, you had to join a theater. When you joined a theater, traditionally, you were going to be assigned to work under an actor, and you were going to learn all those actors' parts. And so if that actor was performing in 4 shows, you would learn those 4 shows and know his part in them. That position was called an understudy because you were studying under the actor. Then one day the actor had a little bit to drink, and while walking to the theater slips on something, hurts his ankle. Well, the understudy goes on that night and takes over until the actor can go back out there. Or the actor becomes so famous, he's going to leave and join another company where he's going to have bigger parts, and when he leaves, you become that permanent person for those parts. And once you become that permanent person, well, eventually they will take on another apprentice who will begin working under you as an understudy, and they are going to learn those parts. And so this was actor training all the way to, the 19th century. And it's going to actually, be pretty solid throughout the 19th century. We are going to have some aberrations and changes that occur, but it's not until the 20th century that we really start to shift away. The most dominant form of the 19th century was Delsarte, where we get away from the understudy system and people start all buying this book and everybody starts going, okay, this is what I have to do to be an actor. The problem with Delsarte's system, and he was very precise in how he made things, is that everybody is picking it up, everybody's learning it, and then every show you see, every actor does the same things. And so you see show after show after show, and it's like, well, you saw how angry he was? Yeah, did you see him? He was waving his fist in the air and yelling. Then you see another show, totally different show, totally different cast, and it's, oh, did you see how angry he was? Yeah, he was standing there waving his fist and yelling. Well, over a period of time, waving your fist and yelling doesn't have the same impact because you've seen it again and again and again. It becomes what we would call cliche. Cliche is just, a really simple word that means it's lost its meaning. Everybody does it. It's what we expect. Look how sad they are. How do you know? They were staring at the ground. Every show, every broken heart was grabbing their chest. Everybody was like, oh, I'm so in love. Oh, they've destroyed me. And this was the style that dominated during melodrama. And so, when people talk about, oh, they're acting melodramatic, in a lot of ways what they're saying is, well, look, Delsarte's system is alive and well. And so this was the system that dominated during melodrama. When we get to realism and we start to find ourselves with Stanislavski, here's the thing. Not everybody who gets angry waves their fist. Not everybody who gets angry yells. Everyone's different in that way. You've all had your parents yell at you. You've also had your mom stare at you or say your full name. It means something a lot different than just yelling and screaming. And so, since not everybody is the same, nobody should be treated the same on stage. And so this was Stanislavski's big thing, is breaking away from this system where everything basically was just repetition of this is what you do, this is what you do, this is what you do. And so his techniques that he came up with and started throwing out there, he developed exercises. He believed that the actor's body and voice had to be worked with constantly. If an actor had to get over a wall, they should be working out so they can get over a wall. He believed that the actor should concentrate moment to moment as if events were happening for the first time. He pushed for improvisation, so actors could learn to act spontaneously, to the environment around them. Of course, he pushed observation. Go out, see what's happening in the world. Talk to people, see how they act, see how they react. And then, of all the things he was pushing around, he also came up with a technique for training that we call the magic if. The magic if. And with all the other things that we can point out on here, the magic if is probably one of the coolest forms of throwing it out there. And basically what he kept always doing to actors, and this is a really hard thing, especially for people who are starting in this, he kept asking them why they were doing certain things and then giving them options. And basically the magic if boils down to this. Mr. Gray, it's not the ideal environment, but there's a knock on this door. What do you do if there's a knock on the door? All right, you get up, you go to the door. All right, now you're at the door. Or you just, you open the door. Okay, you open the door. What do you do if there's a person there holding a crying baby? Close the door. Not my problem. You know, what do you do if you open and there's a person who says, have you seen the light? What do you do if you open the door and there's a person that says, let me tell you about our candidate? What do you do if you open the door and there's a person standing there and they're covered in blood? What do you do if? And so he kept throwing out, all right, what do you do? What do you do? What do you do? Now, here's the big thing that throws people off. His questions were eventually, what does the character do if? What does the character do if? He believed the actors should read everything in that script and study it so they knew the background of the character. A character that has a background working in like medicine opens a door and sees a problem and they start looking for solutions. A person who comes out of the military opens the door, they start looking for a certain round of solutions. A person who, has never had any experience doing anything, they open the door, they start looking for different solutions. What does the character do if? Figuring out how that character would react. That's the magic if. And then emotional memory that they have up there were exercises to try and remember certain periods of your life in order to manifest them currently. And so if on stage, you're at a funeral, well, can you think about that last time you were at a funeral? Well, did that person mean something to you? How did it make you feel to be at their funeral? Did you cry at the funeral? Did you, just stand there quietly at the funeral? Were you making jokes off to the side, which happens at funerals a lot, about, oh man, I remember this time with him and everything else. That's emotional memory, pulling up the past in order to make it part of the present. And the magic if, what if this occurs? How does the character react? These became very standard methods of training actors, and they dominate even today. Stanislavski's system is the system that everybody else begins to follow eventually. If I were in this situation, how would I behave? The system of exercises. Stanislavski's system, when it goes on tour, it's going to get a lot of followers. A lot of people see it. They really want to buy into it. They think it's the greatest thing they've seen. In the United States, a group of actors who see it become so enamored with it, they travel back to Russia because they want to work in the Moscow Art Theater to learn these methods. And so they become students. Their Russian is not very good. Some of them don't even speak Russian, but they have traveled there because they were so impressed with what was going on. They bring back the system to the United States, but remember, they weren't fluent in Russian, and so they have a lot of variations for it. This becomes the dominant model for American actors. They call it the method. The method is nothing more than the American interpretation of Stanislavski. And so that's the dominant form that we have here, but it's still based on Stanislavski. Everything gets based on Stanislavski sooner or later. All right, folks, let me get through the roll and you'll get out of here.